Gabrielle Venora Petito was born March 19, 1999 in Blue Point, a quiet suburb on the southern edge of Long Island, New York. And her arrival marked the beginning of a story that would one day capture the attention of the world. Though in those early years, her life was filled only with the ordinary beauty of family, community, and creativity. And Gabby also grew up in a very supportive and stable household. She was the eldest of 6 siblings and half-siblings. And her parents, Nicole Schmidt and Joseph Petito, separated amicably when Gabby was pretty young, but both remained very active in her life. And Gabby would spend most of her time with her mother, Nicole, who was a teacher's assistant, and her stepfather, Jim, in a household where love was quiet but constant. And her father, Joe, was a warehouse store manager, and he would eventually remarry as well. And Gabby would grow close to his wife, Tara, maintaining strong bonds on both sides of her blended family. So Gabby would grow up in a safe, relatively affluent corner of Long Island, the kind of place where children still rode bikes on tree-lined streets, and neighbors knew each other's names. And even as a child, Gabby stood out for her compassionate nature and quiet creativity. She had a very early sense of empathy that seemed to exceed her years. And at just 14 years old, Gabby and her younger relatives took part in a music video promoting gun violence awareness after the Sandy Hook Elementary School tragedy. And it wasn't a school requirement or assignment. It was just something she chose to do. Something that really reflected the emotional depth she already carried. So even then, Gabby was really paying attention to the world's pain and trying in her own way to be a light. So as Gabby went into her teens, she would attend the Bayport Blue Point High School in Suffolk County, where she became known for her love for art and nature. And Gabby wasn't really the type to chase popularity. She was more of a free spirit, as her family would later describe her. Someone who saw the world in color and tried to paint it that way. And she channeled that spirit into watercolor paintings, photography, and long walks outdoors. So Gabby's path at this point just seemed filled with possibility. The world was her oyster. She was creative and grounded and deeply, deeply kind. And in her time at school, she would cross paths with a man named Brian Laundrie. And they were just friends at first. It was a quiet beginning, but soon the connection would deepen into a relationship that would shape the rest of her life. So by the time she graduated high school in June of 2017, Gabby was already beginning to dream bigger than the borders of Long Island. She had a growing love for travel, a passion for art and storytelling, and a very gentle magnetism that made her unforgettable to those that knew her. And somewhere during those late teens, she would reconnect with a familiar face, a quiet, outdoorsy former classmate named Brian Laundrie. So though Gabby and Brian did attend the same high school at Blue Point, their relationship didn't really fully take root until after graduation. But by early 2019, they were officially together. They were a young couple drawn to each other by shared appreciation for art, nature, and what seemed, from the outside, a desire for something beyond the ordinary. And friends would later describe their relationship in its early stages as intense and very passionate, because they bonded very quickly over similar interests and built routines around being creative together. And Gabby really just found a companion who seemed to reflect her own adventurous energy. And as the relationship began to deepen even more, Gabby made a very big decision, and that was that she would leave New York and move to Northport, Florida, where Brian lived with his parents, Christopher and Roberta Laundrie. And this move in July of 2019 marked a very pivotal shift in Gabby's life, because she was now away from her family and hometown, and she was moving toward a future she was building with Brian. So the couple would move into the Laundrie family household and start settling into their new adult life. Gabby would get a job working as a pharmacy technician at Publix, while Brian worked at a grocery store. And from those watching from the outside, the couple appeared very close. Happy even. One friend described them as couple goals, because from the outside looking in, especially into social media, people would see them often hiking local trails, they would post nature photos, and they would constantly speak about their plans for the future. So there was this sense of momentum for the both of them, of two young people just finding themselves through each other. And Gabby's parents would later say that they were actually very supportive of the move, trusting their daughter's judgment. But they obviously remained attentive because she had a very close-knit family. So Gabby would call home home very regularly. She even visited New York whenever she could. So while she was far from home, the connection with her family never wavered, especially with her mom. And by the end of 2019, Gabby and Brian's relationship had become central to both of their lives. So what began as a high school acquaintance had grown into a full-time partnership, one that over the next 2 years would take them across the country, through national parks and dusty highways, and eventually into the center of a national tragedy. But for now, in that window between teenage dreams and adult responsibility, Gabby was in love, and she was all in. So by mid-2020, the world was beginning to change, as we all remember. The COVID-19 pandemic had swept across the globe, shutting businesses, stalling routines, basically upending nearly every sense of normalcy. And for Gabby and Brian, the pandemic kind of became a pause, a moment of stillness that offered space for something much bigger. Because it was during this time, July 2020, that Brian would propose. And there was no crowd, there was no flashing cameras, there was no elaborate production, just a quiet moment in nature along one of their favorite hiking trails. And as Gabby would later recount, a firefly even landed on her hand when she said yes, as if the world itself paused in agreement. And she announced the news with joy. She would write on Instagram, "Brian asked me to marry him and I said yes." And she would be beaming in this photo of them sharing sushi on their first date. And she would also go on to say, "You make life feel unreal and every day is such a dream with you." It was obviously a massive milestone moment, a formal beginning to the future they were building together. But unlike many couples freshly engaged, they didn't rush towards a wedding date or a venue. Instead, they set their sights on something even more ambitious, a life of full-time travel. And Gabby was overjoyed. This is exactly what she had been working toward her whole life. Art, storytelling, the open road, and someone she believed would share it all with her. So a wedding could wait, the world was waiting first. So the idea of this trip had been taking shape for months, maybe even longer, because they had actually at this point already taken a cross-country road trip together in a Nissan Sentra, camping on the road and falling in love with the rhythm of van life. And that whole experience had left quite a lasting impact on them. So they got to work. The couple purchased a white 2012 Ford Transit Connect van. It was compact, reliable, and just big enough to become a tiny home on wheels. And together, they would customize it. They built out the interior with a handmade bed platform, installed storage units, and painted the walls in soft tones that reflected their love for the natural world. And Gabby added flowers and artwork, and Brian handled much of the carpentry and logistics. So it wasn't anything fancy, but it was theirs. And this was more than just a trip. They envisioned a shared brand, a life lived on the road, documented in photographs and videos. And they would even go on to launch a YouTube channel called Nomadic Static, intending to chronicle their adventure and build an audience. And Gabby would take the full lead on the creative side, organizing content, shooting photos, and dreaming of growing the channel into a full-on career. Because she had always wanted to be a travel blogger, so this wasn't just a vacation, it was her vision for her entire future. And by the end of 2020, this plan was in motion. Gabby would pick up extra hours at Taco Bell and as a nutritionist to save money for the big departure, and Brian helped as well by working extra hours at an organic juice bar. And the relationship, at least in public, appeared pretty solid still. So the couple planned to leave in the early summer, charting a few-month loop across the western United States, with stops at national parks like Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and beyond. And Gabby's family later discussed the possibility of extending the trip if things went well. But before their official departure, they made one more meaningful stop. In late June 2021, Gabby and Brian returned back to Blue Point, New York, where Gabby's younger brother was graduating high school. And it was a brief visit, but it was important, because it was a moment for Gabby to reconnect with her roots, hug her siblings, and say goodbye to the town that raised her. And her family had no idea this would be the last time they would ever see Gabby. So after that brief trip back home, they were off. The van was packed, the cameras were charged, the maps were marked with pins and possibilities. And on July 2nd, 2021, Gabby and Brian pulled out of Blue Point, New York in their white Ford Transit and pointed west. And their plan was to explore the American wilderness, wilderness, document it online, and build something together. Because for Gabby, this would be the foundation of her future as a travel blogger. And the journey began with joy. Gabby shared her first post from the road trip on July 4th, a snapshot from Kansas at Monument Rocks. And over the following weeks, they zigzagged through Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming, stopping at national parks and campgrounds tucked beneath mountain peaks. And they would hike the Great Sand Dunes National Park, pose for photos beneath the towering canyon walls in Zion National Park, and smiled from scenic viewpoints in Bryce Canyon National Park. So Gabby's social media was just filled with soft, sunlit images, showcasing the beauty of the places they visited as they traveled in their home on wheels. And in one Instagram post, Gabby would write, "There's no place like the tiny home we built." So to the outside world, it looked like a dream come true. But behind the filtered lens of social media, something else was brewing. So to their followers, Gabby and Brian seemed like the perfect couple. But those who knew them better saw signs of something darker. Gabby's best friend, Rose Davis, later described Brian as controlling and jealous. And according to Rose, Brian had a way of isolating Gabby, discouraging her from doing anything he didn't approve of. And she would go on to say, he also wanted what he wanted when he wanted, and he'd find a way to get it. Not in a violent manner, but if he didn't want Gabby to do something, he'd find a way to make it so she couldn't do it. And she described a pattern of emotional manipulation that Gabby didn't always recognize for what it was. So this relationship was slowly becoming extremely toxic. And another friend of Gabby's from New York remembered the relationship as volatile. And they said, very high highs and very low lows. And while on the road, those patterns seemed to intensify. Because the stress of van life, confined space, constant travel, no breaks, made everything even more intense. But Gabby felt pressure to keep their content going while managing everything else completely alone. And according to Rose, Gabby confided that Brian didn't want her to pursue her social media and blogs seriously. And Rose believed, quote unquote, that's a sign of domestic abuse. And then in mid-August, something spilled out into the open. Something no amount of Instagram filters could hide. So on the afternoon of August 12th in Moab, Utah, a concerned witness called 911. The caller saying, "We drove by and the gentleman was slapping the girl. Then we stopped, they ran up and down the sidewalk, he proceeded to hit her, hopped in the car, and they drove off." And soon after, Moab police would pull their white van over outside Arches National Park. And what followed was captured on a now infamous body camera footage.
The driver is showing some obscure driving, possibly intoxicated.
Turn off your engine. Go ahead and set your keys on the dash for me, all right? What's going on? How come you're crying?
I'm sorry, we've just been fighting this morning.
And this was a scene that would later be scrutinized by the world. So in the video, Gabby is crying, nearly hyperventilating.
Some days I have really bad OCD, and I was just cleaning when he was straightening up the back of the van before, and I was apologizing to him and saying, I'm sorry that I'm so mean.
And she would apologize profusely to the officer over and over again for herself, for just existing, basically. And she would blame herself for everything. And Brian, by contrast, appeared very calm and composed and even giddy at points.
I feel bad I had to get so public. I was just trying to be loud to listen. This is, I just try to make her calm down and be like, look, everyone's watching. And like, stop this. My heart rate up, whenever the lights flash on, it gets your heart rate up. If I see my...
Trust me, it does me too, and I'm the one
And he said he'd gotten into the van with dirty feet, she got upset, and things escalated from there. And he had scratches on his face and his arms, and Gabby admitted to striking him, but only because she thought he might leave her behind when he locked her out of the vehicle. And he claimed he was attempting to give her some space so she would calm down. And after separating them and interviewing them individually, officers concluded that Gabby had been the primary aggressor.
I've decided I am not going to cite you for domestic violence battery, okay? It was only going to be a Class B misdemeanor. However, the domestic violence portion of it enhances it. Makes like a major pain in the butt, especially you're 22, right? So I'm choosing not to cite you today.
The report described the event as more of a mental health break than domestic violence, which is exactly what it was. And she was not the aggressor. She was scared, terrified of this very large man who had struck her and threatened her and gaslit her and clearly manipulated her over months and months and months and made her feel very small, and then this moment happened and the police didn't do their job, basically. So instead, police arranged for Brian to spend the night at a motel.
This is Brian Laundrie.
All right.
So he's gonna get you all set up with your hotel room.
Paid for through a local domestic violent outreach program. And Gabby took the van and slept at a nearby campground alone. And before parting ways for the night, the couple insisted they were in love, that they didn't want anyone getting in trouble, and that everything would be okay. But in the body cam footage, Gabby's tears tell a very different story. Her anxiety, her fear, her attempts to downplay the moment to protect Brian, even in front of police, saying, I'm sorry. She just kept saying, I'm sorry. And it's honestly just heartbreaking to see, because like knowing people that have been in these situations and being too afraid to get out for the repercussions if they actually speak up, it's just heartbreaking to watch in real time. But unbeknownst to the officers, the 911 dispatcher hadn't relayed the full details of the original call, including the report that Brian had been seen hitting Gabby. And that information could have changed the outcome completely, but it didn't, and they deemed her the primary aggressor. And in hindsight, that stop at Moab one night apart after weeks of growing tension was a flashing red flag, a chance to intervene that just passed by. And the next morning, Gabby and Brian reunited and got back on the road. And they would tell their friends that they were fine and that everything was under control, but something at this point had shifted drastically, and cracks were widening and time was running out. So just 5 days after the emotional police encounter in Moab, Brian Laundrie left Gabby alone. And on August 17th, he flew from Salt Lake City, Utah to Florida, according to his family's attorney. And the reason, they said, was practical. Brian needed to retrieve some personal items and close out a shared storage unit to save money. But whatever the truth, he was gone for nearly a week, leaving Gabby completely alone and behind in Utah. So Gabby would check into the Fairfield Inn Hotel in Salt Lake City, where she stayed alone and waiting. And while she waited, she stayed in contact with her family. And as we know, Gabby had long found peace in nature and in movement. So being grounded in a city on her own felt very foreign and scary. And during this solo stretch on August 19th, Gabby posted what would be her first and only video to the couple's YouTube channel, Nomadic Static. And the video was simply titled Van Life, Beginning Our Van Life Journey. And it was a gentle, aesthetically edited look into travels up to the point that she was at. And it features shots of their van build, the Utah landscape, beaches, and moments of quiet joy between the two of them. And at the time, it felt like a hopeful start. But in retrospect, it became an eerie timestamp, the last creative glimpse she left behind. And on August 23rd, Brian would return. And on the 24th, the couple was seen checking out of the hotel and loading up the van together. And they were heading north towards Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming, one of the most scenic and one of the most remote stretches on their entire route. And 2 days later, on August 25th, Gabby called her mother, and she told her they had reached Wyoming and they were camping near the Spread Creek dispersed camping area. And she said that cell service was pretty spotty there, but she sounded upbeat and mentioned they'd likely head toward Yellowstone next. And that same day, Gabby posted what would be her final Instagram photo, a shot of her smiling in front of a butterfly mural in Ogden, Utah. It was calm and beautiful and haunting in hindsight. And at the time, nothing seemed obviously wrong, but it would be the last time Gabby's voice would be seen or heard directly. So on August 27th, something changed. Around 3 p.m., witnesses saw Gabby and Brian at a restaurant in Jackson, Wyoming. It was a very popular Tex-Mex spot called the Merry Piglets. And according to witnesses, Brian was very visibly agitated, arguing with the staff over the bill, and his tone was aggressive and his body language was very threatening. And Gabby, by contrast, appeared distressed and very apologetic. We've seen this before. And this would be the last known sighting of Gabby Petito alive. And at some point in the day, she allegedly reached out to her ex-boyfriend, Jackson, on Snapchat to say that she was thinking about him. And according to Jackson, she had reached out a few days prior, mentioning that she and Brian were struggling and that she may break up with him. And she would call Jackson later on, but he was unable to answer because he was at work. And that evening, Gabby's mother received an odd text from Gabby's phone, saying, "Can you help Stan? I just keep getting his voicemails and missed calls." And Nicole would freeze. His Stan was Gabby's grandfather, but Gabby never called him by his first name, so the message felt very unnatural. as if someone else had written it. And Nicole would later tell authorities that the text made her feel like something was wrong. And investigators would later include the message in a search warrant affidavit, noting it was out of character and likely not written by Gabby herself. And then on August 30th, one more message came, saying, plainly, "No service in Yosemite." And that text, too, felt off. Not just in the tone, but in the content. Because Gabby had told her mother just days earlier that they were in Wyoming, heading toward Yellowstone. And Yosemite, in California, made no sense for the context of their route. Because the distance was over 800 miles away. So it just wasn't fitting. And Nicole was immediately uneasy. And that would be the last time Gabby's phone would be heard from. And after that, all calls went straight to voicemail. There was no more FaceTimes, no more texts, no more Instagram posts, and no updates from the road. And for a young woman who checked in regularly, who rarely went a day without calling her mom, this was a terrifying silence. And in those final days in August, the world didn't know yet what happened. But Gabby's family felt it. It was a shift in the air, the vacuum left behind by a voice that should have been there. And there was no witnesses to the moment it happened, no videos, no cries for help that made it to the ranger station or nearby campsite. What happened in those final hours only can be pieced together through forensics, scattered clues, and eventually, Brian Laundrie's written confession. And as of right now, this is what we know. After being spotted at the Mary Piglet's restaurant in Jacksonville on August 27th, where Brian was reportedly enraged and Gabby was tearful, the couple returned to their van, driving out toward the Spread Creek area, where they had been camping. At the same evening, a travel blogger named Red, White, and Bethune would unknowingly capture footage. And the footage was of Gabby and Brian's white van, parked off the side of a dirt road alone in the forest. And this was at approximately 6 p.m. on August 27th. And the van in the footage appeared abandoned, quiet, still, and partially closed off by the brush. But this timestamp would later become crucial. And the world, not yet knowing that she was gone, was about to start asking questions. So August 29th, 2021, on the surface, it seemed like any other day in the West. And that morning, a woman named Miranda Baker was driving along the highway when she saw a hitchhiker holding out a thumb. And he introduced himself as Brian.
Hi, my name is Miranda Baker, and on August 29th, my boyfriend and I picked up Brian at Grand Teton National Park at 5:30 at night at Coulter Bay.
And said he was camping alone and offered her $200 for a 10-mile ride. And she agreed. And at first, the conversation was very polite. But when she mentioned that she and her boyfriend were heading to Jackson Hole, Brian visibly panicked. He freaked out, Miranda said later. He asked to get out of the car immediately. And not long after, another woman, Norma Jean Jalovec, also picked up a hitchhiker matching Brian's description. And he asked to be dropped off by Spread Creek campsite, right where Gabby and Brian had last stayed. And she asked if he wanted her to go past the gate and into the area where they were staying. But he became agitated when she brought this up, and he would not let her get any closer, and he just got out of the vehicle immediately. And that same evening, Gabby's phone went silent for good. And a final misleading message to her mother would go out the next day. And after that, no contact and no explanation. And Brian, meanwhile, was already on the move. So between August 30th and September 1st, he began driving the white Ford Transit van east. And Gabby's van was now in his possession. And along the way, he used a debit card and withdrew over $1,000, which was actually a federal crime that would later be used to issue a warrant for his arrest. And this included $700 he had transferred to himself via Gabby's account, with a note on the transfer saying, "Goodbye, Brian. I'll never ask you for anything again." The guy's insanely stupid. Messages were also sent between Brian and Gabby's phone during the time, but the timestamps painted a picture that this was Brian's attempt to establish an alibi. A shitty one at that, because he's fucking stupid.
The activity between the two phones was almost instantaneous. Brian was holding both phones and talking directly to himself. It was apparent that he was trying to create an alibi.
And then on September 1st, Brian Laundrie pulled into the driveway of his parents' home in Northport, Florida, alone. So the white van was back, but Gabby wasn't. And Brian just said nothing. And over the next 10 days, he offered no explanation to anyone. Not to Gabby's parents, not to her friends, not to police. And in fact, Brian refused to speak to authorities at all. And when North Point police visited the laundry home, they were met not by Brian, but by his parents, who handed officers the phone number of their attorney. Gotta love parents that protect their f***ing murderer piece of shit son.
When was the last time that you saw Brian and Gabriel? Well, Brian is here. That's all I'm gonna say.
Gabby's family obviously began to panic at this point. And then, in a strange twist, the Laundrie family, Brian included, reportedly went on a camping trip to Fort De Soto Park from September 6th to September 8th.
When Brian first came home with the van, him, his parents, and his sister Cassie went on a camping trip.
And a neighbor later confirmed seeing them load up a small camper and head out as if nothing were wrong. And this was just days after Gabby's family had begun publicly pleading for help to find Gabby. Meanwhile, the white van, the one so often featured in Gabby's Instagram posts, sat in the laundry driveway, and authorities would later seize it for forensic analysis. So on September 11th, more than 10 days of silence and growing desperation, Gabby's parents would file an official missing persons report in Suffolk County, New York. And North Point police would name Brian as a person of interest a few days later. But still, no cooperation and no answers. And then another twist happens, because on September 13th, Brian told his parents he was going for a solo hike nearby the Carlton Reserve, which was a sprawling, swampy wilderness stretching over 25,000 acres. So he would drive the family's Ford Mustang to the reserve entrance, park it, and disappear into the wetlands. And days would pass and Brian would not return. But strangely, his parents didn't report him missing right away, which is so strange. And it wasn't until September 17th, 4 full days later, that they informed police Brian was gone.
We now have 2 missing young people.
And they said they had retrieved the car from the reserve but hadn't seen him since the 13th. And by then, Gabby's face was everywhere. Her story had gone national, and the case was unfolding in real time across TV screens and social media feeds. Meanwhile, law enforcement was just scrambling to find Brian, who had now just vanished into one of the most difficult terrains in Florida, and who was the only person who could say what had happened to Gabby. But he was gone, and Gabby's body at this point had yet to be found. So by the second week of September 2021, Gabby's family had gone from worried to frantic, and public interest just exploded. Social media detectives, true crime podcasters, and 24/7 cable news networks latched onto the story. And the hashtag #FindGabby began trending across Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Her smiling face, framed by blonde hair and golden filter, became one of the most shared images in the country. And protesters gathered outside the laundry home. And they would chant into megaphones, and they held signs that read, "Where's Gabby?" and "Justice for Gabby." And at the same time, FBI agents, local law enforcement, and search teams were mobilized in Wyoming. And with the help from cell tower pings, digital tracking, and eyewitness accounts, the search narrowed into one location, which was Spread Creek Dispersed Camping Area, east of Grand Teton National Park. And then would come the break, because those family vloggers that got that footage of Gabby's truck would submit that footage to the FBI, and it matched the vehicle Gabby and Brian had been traveling in. And on September 18th, the FBI and local authorities began a ground search in that area. And the very next day, on September 19th, 2021, they made a grim discovery. So somewhere in the wild stillness of Spread Creek Dispersed Camping Area, tucked beneath the shadow of Grand Teton National Park, investigators would find human remains that match Gabby's description. And she would be partially buried, left in a shallow grave surrounded by brush and wild sage. Her body would lay about 900 feet from where the van had last been seen parked. Gabby Petito, at the age of 22 years old, full of light, and just months into an adventure of her life, was killed, and her remains lay exposed to the elements for 3 to 4 weeks before discovery. And the autopsy conducted by Teton County coroner Dr. Brent Blue determined that Gabby died by manual strangulation.
In the manner of death of Gabrielle Lenora Petito, we find the cause and manner to be death by strangulation, and manner is homicide.
And he added that her body had likely been exposed to the elements for 3 to 4 weeks, and that the time of death was estimated at around August 27th, the same day she was last seen at the Mary Piglet's restaurant in Jackson. Just a very brutal and intimate act requiring sustained force applied by bare hands. And the report also noted blunt force trauma to her head and to her neck, just further evidence to a very violent and very personal assault. And this confirmation just sent shockwaves through the country. Gabby Petito, the free-spirited 22-year-old that had been documenting her life on the road, was gone. And the man she had trusted with that journey, Brian Laundrie, had not only returned without her, but was now missing himself. And news of Gabby's death sparked an outpouring of grief and anger. And a makeshift memorial grew rapidly outside the Laundrie home, with mourners leaving flowers, candles, and photos. And in Blue Point, New York, Gabby's hometown, a candlelight vigil lit up the night as hundreds gathered to honor her memory. So Gabby's story had become a cultural flashpoint, not just because of the tragedy, but because of how quickly and widely it spread. And some commentators praised the mobilization of online communities in helping locate her, and others criticized the disparity in media attention compared to the hundreds of missing persons, especially women of color, whose stories remained untold. And still, for her family, the media firestorm was background noise to a singular, searing reality. Gabby was never coming home, and somewhere Brian Laundrie was on the run. So the search for Brian Laundrie became one of the most watched manhunts in modern American history. And by the time Gabby's body was found on September 19th, 2021, Brian had already been missing for nearly a week. And according to his parents, he had told them on September 13th he was going on a hike in the Carlton Reserve, as we know. But that delay in reporting him missing after 4 whole days raised some questions. Why wait? What did they know? And had Brian really gone hiking, or had he used that window to disappear? So authorities could only go off what they knew, and they would launch an extensive search in the Carlton Reserve, deploying divers, canine units, drones, and ATVs. And it was a very unforgiving landscape. It was waterlogged and snake-infested, with terrain that could swallow evidence in hours. And as the days wore on, the task seemed increasingly impossible. And at the same time, public pressure was mounting. Protesters continued to camp outside the Laundrie home, holding signs up and chanting through bullhorns. And across the country, people speculated, theorized, and tracked every development in real time. TikTok videos went viral, analyzing every angle, and police body cam footage was dissected frame by frame. And Brian's face would become as recognizable as Gabby's. And on September 23rd, the FBI issued a federal arrest warrant for Brian Laundrie. Not for homicide, though, but for unauthorized use of Gabby's debit card, a charge that allowed law enforcement to pursue him with federal authority while the homicide investigation continued, which makes sense in hindsight because at this point they don't have much evidence. A lot of circumstantial evidence, but not a lot of physical evidence. Meanwhile, alleged sightings of Brian poured in from across the US, but none were confirmed. And the FBI continued to focus locally, believing Brian may have never left Florida at all. But weeks would pass and the search would just drag on. Tips would dry up, and for a time it seemed that Brian Laundrie had just vanished into thin air. But then, on October 20th, something changed. Because that morning, Chris and Roberta Laundrie told authorities they intended to join the search at the Myakkahatchee Creek Environmental Park, which bordered the Carlton Reserve and had recently been reopened to the public. And just hours into that search, they discovered items belonging to Brian lying near a previously flooded trail. So law enforcement would move in. And nearby, under a canopy of trees and partially submerged into swamp water, investigators found skeletal human remains. And by October 21st, dental records confirmed that the remains were Brian Laundrie's. And the autopsy determined that the cause of death was a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Just took the easy way out. And alongside his remains, investigators recovered a backpack, a notebook, and a revolver. And in that notebook, Brian wrote a confession. So the manhunt was over, and the only person of interest in Gabby Petito's murder was now dead. But the story wasn't finished yet, because there were still questions. What had happened on that trail? And what did Brian's parents know and weren't telling? And about how the system had failed a young woman who was crying for help long before the world heard her. So for months after Brian Laundrie's remains were found, investigators sifted through every piece of evidence recovered at the scene. Most notable among them, a weathered spiral notebook pulled from the dry bag found just feet from his skeletal remains. And in January of 2022, the FBI officially closed the investigation, releasing key details about what was found. And the notebook, stained by water and difficult to read in parts, contained a handwritten confession. And in the note, Brian took responsibility for Gabby's death. That Gabby had allegedly suffered an injury during a hike and was in severe pain. I ended her life. I thought it was merciful, that it is what she wanted, but I see now all the mistakes I made. And he went on to describe what he had claimed had happened. That Gabby allegedly sustained a serious injury during a hike, and it was an unspecified incident that left her in severe pain. And he wrote that she was shivering and freezing and injured, and that she had allegedly asked him to relieve her of her suffering. And he claimed that in that moment of desperation, he killed her out of mercy. And Brian also wrote his intention was to take his own life, citing guilt and despair, saying, "From the moment I decided, took away her pain, I knew I couldn't go on without her." And the confession attempted to paint his actions as tragic but compassionate, a final act of love. But investigators and Gabby's family rejected the narrative completely. Same.
Cause of her death was strangulation and nothing remotely or even close to what he said.
Because the forensic evidence did not support Brian's version of events. Because we know that Gabby suffered manual strangulation and blunt force trauma to her head and to her neck. And the violent nature of her death and attempt to mislead authorities afterward with false texts and her stolen debit cards stood in stark contrast to the idea of a mercy killing. And Gabby's mother claimed that he was a liar and tried to manipulate the story even after death. Just a pathetic piece of shit. And even the setting of confession seemed telling. And the FBI concluded in their final statement issued on January 21st, 2022, that Brian Laundrie was the only person involved in Gabby's death. And the investigation was officially closed. But the grief wasn't, because Gabby's family was left not only with an unbearable loss of their daughter, but with the weight of knowing that her final moments had been violent, terrifying, and lonely. And no explanation from Brian could change that. So if anything, the note only added to their pain. And for them, the truth was not in what Brian wrote, but in what he did. He left Gabby in the wilderness, lied to her family, drove her van home, and then disappeared without a word. So the confession didn't bring any sort of closure. It simply confirmed what they had already feared all along, that the man their daughter had loved had betrayed her in the most permanent way. But even after the deaths of both Gabby and Brian, their story didn't end. And in many ways, it only entered a new chapter. One filled with grief, accountability, and the pursuit of justice in courtrooms, not wilderness trails. And on March 10th, 2022, Gabby's parents filed a civil lawsuit against Brian's parents. And in the suit, they accused the Laundries of intentional infliction of emotional distress, alleging that Brian had informed his parents of Gabby's death shortly after it happened, and that the Laundries then withheld that information while Gabby's family searched for her. And the lawsuit claimed that while the Petito family publicly pleaded for answers, the Laundries remained completely silent. And according to the Petitos, the Laundries' actions and inactions were not just hurtful, but knowingly cruel, which agreed. And in 2022, a Florida judge denied the Laundries' motion to dismiss, allowing the case to move forward. And in the court proceedings, shocking new details emerged. And one entry in Roberta Laundrie's recovered burn after reading letter, allegedly written to Brian, referenced her willingness to help him dispose of the body. Some of the letter reads, "We will always love each other. If you're in jail, I will bake a cake with a file in it. If you need to dispose of a body, I will show up with a shovel and a garbage bag." What? And though the letter's context and timing were debated, its language raised eyebrows, to say the least, and just fueled the Petito family's claims that the Laundries may have been more involved, or at least more informed than they admitted. And by March 2023, the Petito family reached a $3 million wrongful death settlement in a separate suit against Brian Laundrie's estate, which was a symbolic victory since Brian's estate held few assets. But the money, they stated, would go toward the foundation and further effort to support families of missing persons, which I will link down below. And in the wake of unimaginable loss, Gabby's family found a purpose in advocacy, and they launched the Gabby Petito Foundation, which is a nonprofit focused on supporting organizations that help locate missing persons and provide resources to victims of domestic violence. The foundation quickly became a platform for reform, raising awareness about the signs of abusive relationships, as well as disparities in media coverage that often leave missing persons cases involving people of color overlooked. They just didn't want Gabby's death to be in vain. So if they could save even just one person, then Gabby's story would live on. And the foundation has since partnered with the National Domestic Violence Hotline, also the Black and Missing Foundation, and other key advocacy groups, providing grants, emergency funds, and public outreach programs, which I think is amazing. And I want to add that all the proceeds from this video Petito will be going to that foundation. And again, I will link the foundation down below. And Gabby's parents also testified before lawmakers to push the legislation aimed at improving reporting systems, bolstering protections for domestic violence victims, and modernizing law enforcement's abilities to respond to missing persons cases. And several states have proposed and passed bills directly inspired by Gabby's case, including Florida's Gabby Petito's Act, which created a set of 12 questions that are mandatory for law enforcement to ask potential victims during domestic violence calls, which I think, again, is so amazing. And despite public outrage, Chris and Roberta Laundrie have not been criminally charged in a connection with Gabby's death. And their legal strategy has largely remained one of silence. And in multiple interviews, the Petito family has expressed frustration, saying that the Laundries showed no empathy and played a role in prolonging their agony. So this case has just ignited national debate about parental responsibility, legal liability, and how families of suspects navigate tragedies involving their children. And in the years since Gabby's disappearance, the legal battles have continued. But so has her legacy, because her name now represents more than just tragedy. It represents a reckoning, a call to pay attention not only to those who vanish, but to the systems, silences, and red flags that often precede them. So Gabby Petito's voice was taken, but her story still speaks. Gabby Petito's story is absolutely tragic, and it's also a reminder for us to pay attention, to check in, to ask again, to love without harm, and to cherish the journey wherever it may lead. And that is the Gabby Petito case. I know this one was very emotional, as are every one of these cases that I cover, but I think the awareness is extremely important. Just know that you are important, you deserve attention, and you have the right to speak out and be heard. So just know that, and I hope you all stay very, very safe. And remember, I did link those foundations down below. Also, I did put in helplines as well if you need that. But until I see you next time, I will see you beautiful face. Okay? Stay safe. Bye.